Picture a life so opulent it defies belief, where money is endless, luxury is ordinary, and every whim is catered to without question. Now imagine the immense weight of that fortune, the dazzling glare of public fascination, the unspoken loneliness behind gilded doors, and the constant pressure to be more than just an heiress, but a person in your own right. This was the world of Doris Duke, a woman born into staggering wealth, yet one whose life became a riveting tapestry of glamour, sorrow, and audacious defiance. Known in her day as the richest girl in the world, Doris wasn't just another socialite moving through extravagant parties and European tours. She was the last great heiress of America's Gilded Age, a living symbol of an era defined by extraordinary fortunes and even more extraordinary personalities. From the moment she entered the world, Doris Duke was destined for headlines. The only child of tobacco magnate James Buchanan Duke, her inheritance was so vast it seemed almost mythical. A fortune that placed palaces, art collections, and global influence within her reach before she could even speak. But with that privilege came relentless scrutiny, heartbreaking loss, and a series of personal choices that would shock high society and captivate the world for decades. Her story is one of breathtaking contradictions. A woman who championed humanitarian causes and cultural preservation, yet found herself entangled in scandalous relationships and bitter legal battles. She built exquisite homes and gardens that reflected her impeccable taste, while privately wrestling with isolation and mistrust. Today, we invite you to step beyond the glittering surface and truly discover the woman behind the legend. This is not just a tale of unimaginable wealth. It is a deeply human journey through ambition, heartbreak, and resilience. We will explore how Doris navigated the expectations placed upon her, the loves that lifted and shattered her, and the lasting legacy she crafted in spite of, and because of the weight of her name. So settle in, open your mind, and prepare to immerse yourself in a narrative more dramatic, more poignant, and more unforgettable than any fiction. This is the story of Doris Duke, and it is one you will not soon forget. To understand the world Doris Duke was born into, we must first travel to the dusty soil of a North Carolina farm. Her extraordinary fortune did not begin with glittering ballrooms or European estates. It was forged in the humble tobacco fields by her grandfather, Washington Duke. After returning from the Civil War, Washington and his sons, including James Buchanan Duke, known to everyone as Buck, took a small family operation and through sheer ambition and cunning, built an empire. They didn't just sell tobacco, they revolutionized it. Buck Duke possessed a visionary's foresight and a titan's ruthlessness. He understood that the future of industry lay not in competition, but in consolidation and control. He aggressively pursued this vision, employing cutthroat tactics that would become the hallmark of the Gilded Age. He slashed prices to drive smaller competitors out of business, only to buy them up for a pittance once they were bankrupt. He mastered the art of vertical integration, controlling every single step of the process from the seedling to the finished cigarette. This relentless strategy culminated in the creation of the American Tobacco Company in 1890, a colossal trust that effectively monopolized the entire American tobacco industry. For a time, if you smoked in America, you almost certainly paid a toll to the Duke family. But the story of the Duke fortune is not one of pure accumulation. It is also a story of calculated legacy. In 1924, as Buck Duke's health began to fail, he made a series of decisions that would permanently cement his family's name in history and set the stage for his daughter's life. With a stroke of his pen, he endowed Trinity College in North Carolina with a transformative $40 million, a staggering sum that led to its renaming as Duke University. This was not merely a donation. It was the creation of an enduring intellectual monument to the Duke name. His most personal and impactful act, however, was the establishment of a trust fund for his only child, his beloved daughter, Doris. This was not a simple inheritance. It was a meticulously engineered financial fortress designed to protect and grow her wealth long after he was gone. The principal was placed in the care of trustees, with the income generated flowing to Doris. The terms were specific. She would gain full control over this monumental fortune on her 35th birthday. From the moment she was born in 1912, Doris was not just a wealthy child. She was the sole heir to a modern-day throne, an instant multi-millionaire whose every future need and extravagant desire were already guaranteed. She was quite literally the product of her father's empire, born into a gilded cage of his own magnificent design. And so, on a cold November day in 1912, in a sprawling Fifth Avenue mansion that served as the family's New York residence, Doris Duke drew her first breath. She entered a world that was already waiting for her, a world that had already written the first chapter of her story. From the very beginning, she was not merely a baby, she was an event. The press, captivated by the sheer scale of the Duke fortune, instantly crowned her the million-dollar baby. This was not an affectionate nickname, but a public declaration of her status, a label that would define her long before she could understand what it meant. Her birth was reported not just in the society pages, but on front pages across the country. Her every detail a subject of intense public fascination. Her christening was a spectacle worthy of a royal princess, a clear signal of the life she was destined to lead. She was baptized in a gown of handmade Valenciennes lace, an exquisite garment reportedly valued at $5,000, a sum that could have purchased a comfortable home for an average family at the time. The ceremony was less a quiet religious observance and more a state function, a display of the family's immense power and wealth for all of New York's high society to witness. Every detail was scrutinized and publicized, from the guest list to the gifts, cementing her image not as a child, but as an heir, a symbol, a priceless object. This constant glare of attention created a profound and isolating paradox. While she resided in palatial homes filled with servants and surrounded by every material comfort imaginable, genuine human connection was often the one luxury withheld. Her father, Buck Duke, adored her and saw in her the future of his dynasty. But his love was intertwined with immense expectation. Her mother, Nanelyn Holt Inman, a Southern belle who had married into this fortune, was often preoccupied with the rigid protocols of high society and securing their place within it. Their world was one of strict schedules, nannies, and governesses, where a child's emotional needs could easily be overshadowed by the demands of legacy and public image. Doris's childhood, therefore, was one of unparalleled privilege and profound loneliness. She grew up behind imposing gates, her playmates often the children of staff or the carefully vetted offspring of other elite families. Her world was a curated existence of private lessons, European tours, and being dressed in the finest clothes. Yet it was also a world where she learned to be wary of strangers, of photographers, and of anyone who might see her not for who she was, but for what she represented. The weight of her name was a constant presence, a shadow that both protected and isolated her, teaching her from her earliest days that trust was a complicated and dangerous currency. She was the center of a universe she never asked for, living a life of gilded isolation where her every move was watched, celebrated, and commodified, all before she had even learned to speak in full sentences. If the Fifth Avenue mansion was the stage for her public debut, then Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, was the breathtakingly beautiful fortress where Doris Duke's childhood truly unfolded. Perched on a dramatic, windswept cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, the estate was a monument to Gilded Age excess. Originally built for the Vanderbilt family, it was purchased by Buck Duke in 1922, a 78-room behemoth of stone and opulence designed to announce the family's arrival among America's most elite. For a young girl, it was a world of almost unimaginable scale and beauty, with manicured lawns stretching to the sea, vast marble halls echoing with footsteps, and rooms filled with priceless European art and antiques. Yet, for all its magnificence, Rough Point was in many ways a profoundly lonely gilded cage. Within those sprawling acres and behind those imposing gates, Doris's daily life was one of structured isolation. She was primarily raised by a small army of staff namies, governesses, cooks, and maids who attended to her every physical need, but could never replace the emotional presence of a parent. Her mother, Nanelin, was a distant figure, less a nurturing maternal force and more a strict supervisor of social protocol. Ambitious and status-obsessed, Nanelin was deeply focused on molding her daughter into the perfect heiress, a jewel of high society who would marry appropriately and uphold the family's prestigious name. Her concern was less with Doris's happiness and more with her presentation, enforcing a rigid schedule of lessons in etiquette, languages, and the arts, all designed to prepare her for a life of public scrutiny. The one bright, anchoring presence in this emotionally cool landscape was her father, Buck. Despite his immense wealth and power, he doted on his only child, whom he affectionately called Doll Baby. He was the one who brought a sense of warmth and genuine affection into her life, indulging her whims and seeming to see the person behind the inheritance. He encouraged her interests, even the unconventional ones, and his love provided a crucial counterbalance to her mother's cold ambition. He was her protector, her champion, and the foundation of her world, which is why his death in 1925 was such a cataclysmic event. Doris was just 12 years old. The man who was her emotional center was suddenly gone, and with his passing, the architecture of her life shifted irrevocably. The private loss was immediately compounded by an overwhelming public reality. In his will, Buck Duke left the vast majority of his staggering $100 million estate, a sum equivalent to over $1.5 billion today, to his beloved daughter. Overnight, the young girl grieving for her father was formally anointed as the primary beneficiary of one of America's greatest fortunes. The trust fund he had so carefully engineered now defined her future in absolute terms. This inheritance did not liberate her. It finalized her sentence within the gilded cage. The weight of that fortune and the expectations that came with it settled upon her young shoulders with a crushing finality. The staff and trustees now reported to her, but they also controlled her access to the wealth until her 35th birthday. Her mother's social ambitions for her intensified, now backed by the sheer financial power of the estate. The public's fascination with the richest girl in the world reached a fever pitch. At an age when most children are navigating the complexities of school and friendships, Doris was navigating the complexities of profound grief under the unblinking eye of the world, her life now permanently framed by the immense legacy of the father she adored and lost. Rough Point was no longer just a childhood home. It was the symbol of a destiny she had not chosen, a magnificent and lonely kingdom inherited from a king who was gone. By the time she turned 18 in 1930, the carefully constructed path for Doris Duke's life was already set in stone, at least in the eyes of her mother and the society that watched her every move. That path led directly to the glittering ballrooms of New York's elite, and it culminated in a single, inescapable event, her debutante ball. In the world of old money, a debut was far more than a lavish party. It was a sacred ritual, a formal presentation of a young woman to society, signaling that she was now of marriageable age and ready to assume her predetermined role within the upper echelons of power. For Nayland Duke, this was the pinnacle of her ambitions for her daughter, a chance to officially launch Doris into the marriage market and secure a dynastic union that would further cement the family's prestige. The event itself was a spectacle of almost unimaginable extravagance, even for the depths of the Great Depression. While millions of Americans stood in bread lines, Nayland spared no expense, spending a then astronomical $50,000, equivalent to nearly $1 million today, to ensure her daughter's debut was the most talked about event of the social season. The ball was held at the Duke's French Renaissance-style mansion on 78th Street and 5th Avenue, a building so vast it was known as the Palazzo. The house was transformed into a fantastical garden for the evening, filled with thousands of orchids, roses, and lilies. An orchestra played for the 500 young guests from the most exclusive families, while their parents looked on from the sidelines, and the supper menu was a lavish display of luxury that seemed to exist in a different universe from the struggles of the world outside. For the public, devouring every detail in the newspapers, it was the ultimate fantasy. Doris was no longer just the $1 million baby. She was now the richest girl in the world, a living fairy tale princess whose every move was chronicled. They read about her exquisite Mainbacher gown, her flawless pearls, and the sheer scale of the wealth on display. But for Doris, the evening was a paradox. It was both her coronation and her imprisonment. She performed her role with grace and poise, dancing with the eligible young men presented to her, but those who knew her well could see a reticence, a distance in her eyes. She was playing a part written by her mother on a stage built by her father's fortune for an audience she deeply distrusted. This immense pressure to marry well and continue the dynasty became a central point of conflict between mother and daughter. Nayland viewed a suitable marriage as Doris's primary, if not sole, purpose, a transaction that would merge wealth with an ancient name, providing the social legitimacy she craved. She presented a parade of Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, bachelors from established families, expecting Doris to select a husband as one would select a fine piece of art for its pedigree and value. But Doris's spirit was fundamentally rebellious. She was intellectually curious, independent, and deeply resistant to the idea of being treated as a prize broodmare for the aristocracy. She had no interest in becoming an ornament on some dull millionaire's arm. She longed for genuine connection, for passion, and for a life defined by her own choices, not her mother's social climbing. This friction created a simmering tension that would define her early adulthood. While she complied with the external rituals of her station, attending parties, making appearances, she increasingly sought out ways to assert her autonomy. She developed a passion for fast cars, a decidedly unladylike hobby that thrilled her and scandalized her mother. She gravitated towards people outside the stuffy confines of high society, finding more interesting conversation with artists, musicians, and travelers. The debutante ball was the grand finale of her childhood as her mother's project. In its aftermath, Doris Duke began the far more complicated and compelling work of inventing herself. Her mother's relentless campaign for a suitable marriage finally seemed to yield its prize in the form of James H.R. Cromwell, known to everyone as Jimmy. A charming and ambitious socialite 13 years her senior, Jimmy moved in the same elite circles as the Dukes, but brought something new to the table: political aspirations and a silver tongue. He was the son of a prominent diplomat, cultured, well-connected, and possessed an undeniable charisma that could fill a room. To the outside world, and especially to Nainolin, he appeared to be the perfect match. He had the right name, the right manners, and the right ambition to provide the social legitimacy Nainolin so desperately craved for her daughter. For a mother obsessed with Dynasty, a future senator or even vice president was a far more glittering prize than a mere banker or industrialist. The courtship was a whirlwind, played out in the society columns that had followed Doris since birth. They were a glamorous couple, photographed at parties and premieres, their union seemingly blessed by both family and fortune. Doris, just 22 years old, and still yearning to break free from her mother's suffocating control, may have seen in Jimmy not just a charming suitor, but a potential ally. He represented a life of purpose beyond the ballroom, a partnership that could offer both excitement and an escape from Nainolin's direct oversight. In a very real sense, Jimmy Cromwell offered a door out of her gilded cage, and in 1935, she chose to walk through it. Their wedding was a massive, press-frenzied event, but it was also starkly revealing of the tensions that would come to define their relationship. In a move that shocked high society, Doris insisted on signing a formidable prenuptial agreement. This was not the act of a naive young girl swept away by romance. It was the first major declaration of her financial acumen and her deep-seated wariness. Having seen how men were drawn to her fortune rather than to her, she was determined to protect the one thing that granted her true independence. The agreement explicitly walled off her vast inheritance from her new husband, ensuring he could not touch the principal of her trust fund. It was a clear signal that while she might share her life with him, she would not be handing him the keys to her kingdom. Almost from the moment they returned from their honeymoon, the cracks in their fairy tale began to show. Jimmy Cromwell, it turned out, had grand plans, and they all required Doris's money to fund them. He had political ambitions, eyeing a Senate seat from New Jersey, and he viewed his wife's astronomical wealth not as her separate property, but as the natural fuel for his own career. He embarked on a lavish and expensive campaign, bankrolled entirely by Doris's income. He purchased a grand estate in New Jersey to establish residency through extravagant fundraisers and essentially used her fortune as his personal political war chest. This created an immediate and corrosive tension. Jimmy began to exert control, attempting to manage her finances and involve himself in her dealings with the trustees, often to their great frustration. He encouraged her to make large, showy donations to his preferred charitable causes, which were often aligned with his political image. The dynamic quickly shifted from one of partnership to one of appropriation. He wasn't just her husband. He was a man trying to harness a financial hurricane for his own purposes. Doris, fiercely protective of her autonomy, grew increasingly resentful. The man who had promised an escape was now building a new, more politically charged cage around her. The marriage became a painful lesson in the difficulty of discerning true affection from calculated ambition. Was Jimmy Cromwell genuinely in love with the quiet, intelligent woman he married? Or was he in love with the limitless possibilities her fortune represented? The evidence increasingly pointed to the latter. He enjoyed the lifestyle her money provided, the homes, the travel, the influence, but seemed frustrated by the legal and practical barriers she had wisely erected. Their union, born from a mother's calculation and a daughter's hope for freedom, quickly devolved into a cold war of quiet resentment, played out in sprawling estates and whispered arguments in opulent drawing rooms, a stark reminder that even the greatest wealth could not buy unconditional love. If the wedding was a spectacle, the honeymoon that followed was nothing short of a global phenomenon, a 13-month masterclass in extravagance that would become the stuff of legend. Fresh from the ceremony, Doris and Jimmy Cromwell didn't simply embark on a trip. They launched a traveling court, a rolling testament to the limitless power of the Duke fortune. This was not a journey planned for intimacy or quiet discovery. It was a deliberate, jaw-dropping display of wealth designed to stun the world and perhaps to finally give Doris the freedom to explore it on her own unparalleled terms. Their mode of transport set the tone for the entire adventure. Understanding that conventional travel would never suffice, Doris commissioned 2 custom-built, armor-plated Packard limousines. These were not mere cars. They were fortresses on wheels, equipped with every conceivable luxury for overland travel across continents. When their path was blocked by ocean or terrain the cars couldn't conquer, the solution was just as audacious. The massive automobiles were simply hoisted onto ships or loaded onto custom rail cars, following the couple wherever their whims dictated. The image of these 2 behemoths, disgorged from a freighter in a foreign port, was a clear announcement that the richest girl in the world had arrived, and she had brought her entire world with her. Their notion of packing redefined the concept altogether. Ordinary luggage was for ordinary tourists. The Cromwells traveled with entire suites of furniture. Her favorite bed, his preferred desk, ornate lamps, cherished rugs, and countless trunks of designer clothing. The idea of sleeping on unfamiliar mattresses or eating at standard hotel tables was apparently unthinkable. Upon arriving at even the most luxurious hotels, from Cairo to Calcutta, their staff would immediately take over entire floors, not just for privacy, but to have enough space to unpack their lives and redecorate the rooms to their exacting standards. They would effectively move in, transforming impersonal suites into replicas of their own lavish homes, creating a bubble of familiar opulence in every corner of the globe. For Doris, this grand tour was far more than a prolonged vacation. It was her awakening. Unshackled from her mother's direct supervision and the stifling expectations of Newport and New York society, she was finally able to indulge her own sophisticated tastes and intellectual curiosity. The journey became a voracious collecting spree, the founding moment of her life as a serious patron and connoisseur. While Jimmy was often preoccupied with his own agendas, Doris immersed herself in the cultures she visited, seeking out not souvenirs, but treasures. She ventured into tiny, hidden workshops in India and Indonesia, developing a prescient eye for the exquisite craftsmanship of Islamic and Southeast Asian art, long before it was fashionable among Western collectors. She didn't just buy things, she built collections. She acquired entire temple carvings from Bali, intricate Mughal jewelry, rare Persian textiles, and priceless European antiques, shipping them all back to await her return. These objects were not mere trophies of wealth. They were the beginning of her life's work, the foundational pieces that would eventually fill her homes and become the core of her philanthropic legacy. This honeymoon voyage was her real education, the process through which the million-dollar baby evolved into a woman of genuine worldliness and discernment, using her fortune not just to see the world, but to understand it and preserve its most beautiful creations. It was the first true act of self-creation for Doris Duke, even as she played the part of the lavish American heiress for a captivated global audience. Yet even as she navigated the complex dynamics of her marriage and indulged her passion for global exploration, another dimension of Doris Duke's character was beginning to emerge, one that would ultimately define her legacy far more than any headline-grabbing purchase or society scandal. Beneath the glamorous image of the world-traveling heiress lay a profound and genuine desire to use her fortune for good, a sense of responsibility that was awakened during those formative years abroad. This philanthropic impulse was not a later-in-life conversion. It was a core part of her identity, often carefully shielded from the public gaze, but actively cultivated through her early charitable ventures. This sense of duty was, in many ways, her father's final and most impactful gift. The Doris Duke Trust, which he had established to manage her inheritance, was not merely a financial vehicle. It was engineered with a specific, benevolent purpose. The trust's founding documents explicitly directed that its income should be used not only for her benefit, but also for religious, charitable, and educational purposes. From the moment she began receiving distributions as a young woman, a portion of that colossal wealth was legally and ethically earmarked for helping others. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a mandate woven into the very fabric of her fortune, a constant reminder from the father she adored that such immense privilege came with an equally immense responsibility to give back. And give back she did, with a focus and discernment that revealed a mind far more thoughtful than the tabloids credited her with. While still in her 20s, she began making significant strategic donations that hinted at the major philanthropist she would become. She displayed a particular soft spot for the most vulnerable, directing substantial funds to children's hospitals, including a landmark gift to the Babies Hospital in New York City, which would later become a part of the Columbia University Medical Center. This was not a casual, one-off donation. It was a sustained commitment to pediatric care, reflecting a deep-seated empathy that perhaps stemmed from her own isolated childhood. Her philanthropic vision, however, extended far beyond traditional charity. She understood that culture and art were essential to the human spirit, and she became a quiet but vital patron of the arts during a time when many institutions were struggling. She provided crucial funding for struggling ballet companies, theater groups, and museums, recognizing that preserving beauty and creativity was itself a form of humanitarian work. Perhaps most tellingly, she looked back to her family's roots, funding agricultural research and improvement projects in North Carolina. This was a deeply personal investment, an acknowledgement of the tobacco fields where the Duke fortune began, and a desire to contribute to the economic well-being of the region that built her family's empire. These early acts of giving were rarely accompanied by press releases or public ceremonies. Unlike her mother, who viewed philanthropy as a social obligation to be performed in the spotlight, Doris often preferred to work quietly, away from the glare of publicity. This approach allowed her to avoid the sycophants and opportunists who constantly swarmed around her, ensuring her donations were motivated by genuine interest and careful research, rather than a desire for public acclaim. In these early, thoughtful choices supporting health, culture, and sustainable agriculture, we see the blueprint for the visionary philanthropist she would later become. It was a quiet awakening, a private commitment to stewardship that ran in parallel to her very public life, proving that the richest girl in the world was also, in her own way, one of the most thoughtful. Yet even as she navigated her complex marriage and indulged her global passions, a world-altering event was looming that would redefine the role of every American, including the richest girl in the world. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the nation mobilized entirely, and the era of carefree extravagance came to an abrupt halt. For women of Doris Duke's social standing, expectations were starkly clear: retreat to the safety of a country estate, host fundraisers, and maintain a dignified, supportive presence on the home front. Many of her peers did exactly that, often facing public criticism for appearing insulated from the widespread hardship and sacrifice. But Doris, true to her fiercely independent nature, defied this passive role entirely. She did not merely write checks from a distance, though she did that, and generously. She actively plunged into the chaos of a world at war, determined to make a tangible difference. Her first and most audacious move was to secure credentials as a foreign correspondent. Leveraging her connections and undeniable persuasive power, she landed an assignment with Harper's Bazaar, not to cover fashion, but to report on the human impact of the conflict from the front lines. This was no publicity stunt. In 1944, she traveled to the heart of the war in Italy, a nation ravaged by fighting and bitterly divided between Allied and Axis forces. She left behind the safety of Newport in New York to witness the devastation firsthand, driven by a need to see the truth for herself and to tell the stories of those caught in the crossfire. Her articles focused not on military strategy, but on the grim reality of life for civilians, particularly the women and children struggling to survive amid the ruins of their cities. But Doris Duke was never content to be just an observer. Her wealth granted her a unique form of mobility and influence, and she used it not for personal comfort, but as a tool for aid. While officially there as a journalist, she immediately began engaging in unofficially sanctioned humanitarian work, operating in the blurred lines where reporting ended and relief began. She used her own money, vast sums of it, to provide immediate, on-the-ground assistance. She would personally fund the establishment of makeshift soup kitchens that fed hundreds of displaced families a day. She located supplies of scarce medicines and had them distributed to overwhelmed field hospitals. In a particularly telling anecdote, upon discovering a convent sheltering orphans who were starving and freezing, she didn't just report on it. She used her resources to arrange for a consistent delivery of food, coal, and warm clothing, effectively saving countless young lives through her direct intervention. This work brought her into direct contact with the war's most tragic victims, refugees. She spent days interviewing and assisting families who had lost everything, hearing their stories and documenting their plight. This firsthand exposure to human suffering on such a colossal scale deeply affected her. The experience stripped away any remaining illusions of a world ordered by privilege and reinforced her conviction that her fortune carried a profound responsibility to act. She wasn't playing at being a nurse or a social worker. She was a pragmatic problem solver, using her logistical savvy and financial power to cut through red tape and get help where it was needed most desperately. Her contributions on the home front were equally significant, though far less publicized. She quietly made enormous financial donations to various war funds, including the purchase of substantial war bonds that directly supported the government's efforts. She opened up her Newport estate, Rough Point, for use by the military, and she encouraged the staff on her various properties to contribute to the war effort in whatever capacity they could. This period revealed a Doris Duke, who was the antithesis of the detached, frivolous heiress. It showcased her courage, her compassion, and her relentless drive to engage with the world's problems directly. In the crucible of war, she transformed from a symbol of peacetime luxury into a woman of substance and action, setting the stage for the decades of strategic, impactful philanthropy that would define her later years. Yet amidst the global turmoil of war and the profound personal disillusionment of her first marriage, Doris Duke began quietly constructing a sanctuary, a personal refuge that would become her most enduring and passionate creative project. The seeds for this haven were sown during that transformative 13-month honeymoon, a journey that introduced her not just to the world, but to a specific artistic tradition that resonated with her soul. While traveling through North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, she was utterly captivated by the intricate beauty of Islamic art and architecture. She wasn't a casual tourist admiring the sights. She was a discerning collector falling in love. The geometric precision of mosaic tiles, the lyrical flow of Arabic calligraphy, the cool serenity of courtyards with reflecting pools. These elements spoke to her in a way that the opulent but often stuffy European styles of her childhood homes never had. This wasn't a passing fancy. It was a deep, intellectual, and aesthetic awakening. She began acquiring pieces with a voracious and highly educated appetite, seeking out not just decorative objects, but significant works of art. Ceramic vessels from 13th century Iran, ornate metalwork from Mughal India, exquisite textiles from Ottoman Turkey. She developed relationships with dealers and scholars, educating herself on centuries of artistic history with the same focus she applied to everything that truly interested her. She realized that these treasures deserved more than storage. They needed a home that was itself a work of art, a setting that would honor their cultural context and breathtaking craftsmanship. And so, the vision for Shangri-La was born. Following her divorce from Jimmy Cromwell in 1940, and seeking a fresh start, far from the judgmental eyes of East Coast society, Doris turned her gaze to the Hawaiian island of Oahu. In 1938, she had purchased a spectacular 5-acre oceanfront plot in Honolulu, overlooking the Pacific Ocean and Diamond Head. This was to be the canvas for her masterpiece. She partnered with a young architect named Marion Sims Wyeth, but make no mistake, this was Doris's project from the ground up. She was not a client handing over a vague idea. She was the driving creative force, the visionary who oversaw every single detail. The construction of Shangri-La was a monumental undertaking that would span decades, evolving and expanding as her collection grew. She envisioned a seamless blend of indoor and outdoor space, a modern home that paid respectful and authentic homage to Islamic design principles. Local Hawaiian lava rock was used to construct walls that echoed the sturdy fortresses of the Middle East. Specially commissioned tiles, many created by craftsmen she brought over from Iran and Morocco, covered surfaces in brilliant, complex patterns. Elaborately carved wooden screens known as mashrabiyah were installed, filtering the brilliant Hawaiian sunlight into delicate patterns on the floors. Courtyards featuring central fountains and reflecting pools became the heart of the home, providing cool, tranquil spaces that connected the living areas to the lush tropical gardens. Every room was designed as a gallery for her ever-expanding collection, but it was never meant to feel like a museum. It was a living, breathing home where art was integrated into daily life. She installed a 15th century Persian mihrab, a prayer niche from a mosque, as a stunning focal point in her living room. Exquisite ceramic tiles lined the swimming pool, turning a simple dip into an immersive artistic experience. She even commissioned a dedicated playhouse on the grounds to serve as a private cinema and entertainment pavilion, its interior adorned with dazzling mirrored mosaics from India. Shangri-La was far more than a lavish winter home. It was the ultimate expression of Doris Duke's true self. It represented her escape from the rigid expectations of her inheritance, her profound intellectual curiosity, and her impeccable, forward-thinking taste. It was a place where she could truly be herself, surrounded by the art she loved, in a setting of her own design. This Hawaiian hideaway became her sanctuary, her passion project, and ultimately, her greatest gift to the world. A breathtaking monument to beauty and cultural fusion that stands today as one of the finest collections of Islamic art anywhere on the globe. While the tabloids were busy chronicling her glamorous travels and romantic entanglements, Doris Duke was quietly, and with immense scholarly dedication, building a legacy of cultural preservation that would far outlast any headline. Her identity as a serious art collector and patron was the core of her intellectual life, a pursuit she approached not as a hobby for a wealthy dilettante, but with the focus and erudition of a museum curator. This was not about amassing pretty objects. It was a profound mission to understand, celebrate, and safeguard the artistic heritage of the Islamic world, a field largely overlooked by Western collectors of her era. Her approach to collecting was remarkably meticulous and hands-on. She didn't simply send agents to auctions with a blank check. She immersed herself in the history and techniques of the art forms she loved, developing a connoisseur's eye that earned the respect of dealers and scholars. Her acquisitions were deliberate and deeply informed. She forged long-term relationships with legendary dealers like Hagup, Kevorkian in New York, who became a trusted advisor, guiding her toward the most significant pieces and helping her navigate the complex international art market. She also worked directly with curators at institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, engaging in thoughtful dialogue about artistic merit and provenance, treating them as peers rather than mere employees. Her travels became targeted acquisition trips. A journey to Spain was not complete without seeking out exquisite examples of Hispano-Moorish ceramics, their metallic luster capturing a unique moment of cultural fusion. In Morocco, she was drawn to the vibrant geometric patterns of Berber textiles and the intricate woodwork of ancient Medinas. But it was Iran and India that held a particular fascination for her. She made multiple trips to Iran, then still under the rule of the Shah, where she acquired breathtaking examples of Safavid-era silks, illuminated manuscripts, and most notably, entire rooms of 18th and 19th century ceramic tiles. These weren't small souvenirs. She would purchase entire architectural elements, vaulted ceilings, walls of panels, intricate mosaic fountains, and have them carefully dismantled, crated, and shipped to Hawaii to be integrated into the very structure of Shangri-La. This method highlights her grand vision. Doris did not want Shangri-La to be a sterile showroom where art was displayed behind glass. She envisioned it as a living, breathing synthesis, a place where these masterpieces could be experienced in a context that honored their original spirit. Every object she acquired was chosen with a specific place in mind within her evolving home. A 13th century Persian incense burner would find a home on a mantelpiece. A set of Ottoman velvet cushions would be arranged on a divan. A magnificent Mughal jade cup might be placed on a table not as a locked-away artifact, but as a beautiful object to be appreciated daily. She was creating immersive environments, crafting rooms that felt both authentically of their original culture and uniquely her own. This vision extended beyond mere decoration. She saw Shangri-La as a genuine center for cultural exchange and education, long before that term became commonplace. She frequently hosted scholars, artists, and musicians, offering them a residency in this inspiring setting to study the collection and create new work. She believed that by bringing people into direct, intimate contact with these artistic traditions, she could foster a greater understanding between the East and West. In this way, her home became an active salon, a private institution dedicated to dialogue and appreciation, far from the formal halls of traditional museums. Through her passionate and scholarly collecting, Doris Duke transformed herself from the world's richest girl into one of its most visionary and impactful cultural custodians, ensuring that the beauty she so loved would inspire generations to come. Despite the glamorous facade they presented to the world, the foundation of Doris and Jimmy Cromwell's marriage had been crumbling almost from the very beginning. The hopeful alliance that had promised an escape from her mother's control quickly revealed itself to be a new kind of confinement, one built on financial expectation and political ambition rather than mutual respect. The growing estrangement between them was a quiet, Cold War fought in the drawing rooms of their lavish homes, a fundamental mismatch of desires that no amount of money could paper over. Doris, an intensely private and intellectually curious woman, longed for genuine partnership and the freedom to explore her own interests. Jimmy, however, saw the marriage primarily as a vehicle for his own aspirations, and his wife's vast fortune as the fuel that would power his ascent. His political career became the central point of friction, a constant drain on her resources and a source of bitter resentment. After using her money to secure a Senate seat from New Jersey in 1940, his tenure was brief and largely unremarkable, ending after a single term. The failure was not just a personal blow to his ego. It was a very public and expensive demonstration that Doris's wealth could not buy genuine political talent or lasting influence. The campaign expenses, the lavish entertaining, the constant pressure to make high-profile donations to causes that boosted his image, it all felt like a transaction, one in which she was the banker and he was the client. He grew increasingly bold in his attempts to manage her financial affairs, clashing repeatedly with the trustees of her estate, who were duty-bound to protect her fortune from exactly this kind of encroachment. The final irrevocable break came with the dawn of World War II, a global crisis that laid bare the profound difference in their characters. While Doris felt a powerful call to action, eventually traveling to the front lines to contribute directly to the war effort, Jimmy's response was starkly different. He became involved with a controversial organization called the America First Committee, which advocated for the United States to remain isolated from the conflict in Europe. This isolationist stance, particularly after the horrors of Pearl Harbor, was seen by many as not just misguided, but deeply unpatriotic. For Doris, who was preparing to risk her own safety to report on the war and assist refugees, her husband's political alignment was the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that they inhabited entirely different moral universes. The chasm between them was now too wide to cross. The divorce, finalized in 1943, was a protracted and bitterly contested affair. Jimmy Cromwell, understanding that the door to the Duke fortune was closing, fought tenaciously for a financial settlement that reflected what he believed was his due. In the end, he received a sum rumored to be in the millions, a staggering payout for a marriage that had lasted less than a decade. For Doris, the settlement was a painful but necessary price to pay for her freedom. It was also a brutal lesson, one that solidified a wariness of others' motives that would shape the rest of her life. The experience confirmed her deepest fear, that in the eyes of many, she was not a person to be loved, but a fortune to be accessed. This first failed union became a defining crucible, hardening her resolve to protect her independence above all else, and teaching her that the most valuable thing her money could buy was the power to walk away. Emotionally unmoored after the bitter end of her first marriage and profoundly changed by the sobering experiences of war, Doris Duke returned to the glittering social whirl of New York and Europe with a new, more reckless hunger for excitement. It was in this vulnerable, searching state that she encountered a force of nature who seemed to embody the very opposite of her cautious, cerebral nature. The dashing Dominican diplomat and legendary international playboy, Porfirio Rubirosa. Known to everyone in gossip columns and elite circles simply as Ruby, he was a hurricane of charisma, danger, and seduction. And for a time, Doris willingly let herself be swept away. Rubirosa was a figure straight out of a pulp novel, whose reputation far outstripped his modest diplomatic postings. A former polo player and a confident charmer, he was famously described by writer Taki Theodorakopoulos as being, to the 20th century, what Casanova was to the 18th. He was a man who lived his life at a full gallop, leaving a trail of dazzled women and jealous men in his wake. His name was synonymous with two things: his unparalleled prowess as a great lover, a reputation he cultivated with meticulous care, and his well-documented penchant for pursuing the world's wealthiest women. He had already been married to two fabulously rich heiresses, Danielle Daria and, most notably, Doris Duke's own acquaintance, the Woolworth heiress Barbara Hutton. To the press and the public, Ruby was the ultimate fortune hunter, a man who treated matrimony like a highly lucrative professional sport. Their romance ignited in the late 1940s with the sudden intensity of a flashbulb, instantly blinding the society pages. They were the ultimate jet-set couple before the term even existed, photographed at the most exclusive nightclubs in Paris, gambling in Monaco, and cheering at polo matches in Palm Beach. He offered her a world of pure, unadulterated sensation, where her life had been one of careful calculation and intellectual pursuit. Ruby was all about the thrill of the moment. He was virile, attentive, and excitingly unpredictable. For Doris, who had spent a lifetime surrounded by men who were either intimidated by her wealth or wanted to manage it, Rubirosa's bold, unapologetic masculinity was a potent aphrodisiac. He wasn't asking for control of her fortune. He was inviting her on an adventure. The relationship was a worldwide spectacle, a source of endless fodder for columnists like Collie Knickerbocker and Walter Winchell. The press dubbed them the money honey and the glamour gigolo, reveling in the sheer theatricality of their pairing. The public was equally captivated, watching their every move as if it were a real-life romantic drama. But behind the glamorous facade, the relationship was built on an inherently unstable foundation. It was a collision of two vastly different worlds and motivations. Doris, for all her worldly experience, was likely seeking a passionate escape, a chance to feel truly alive after years of emotional disappointment. Rubirosa, however, was a consummate professional in the art of courtship. His entire life was a performance designed to captivate and acquire. The relationship burned intensely but burned out quickly, lasting only a few tumultuous months. The very qualities that made Ru, by so exciting his restlessness, his vanity, his undeniable ambition, also made him impossible for a woman of Doris's intelligence and need for autonomy to build any kind of future with. He was a man who thrived on the chase and the conquest, not the mundane reality of a settled life. There were whispers of his infidelities, of his explosive temper, and of his constant, almost transactional expectation of lavish gifts. The fairy tale began to curdle, revealing the cynical calculation underneath the romantic overtures. Their final split was as dramatic as their courtship, culminating in a legendary, almost mythological parting gift. As the story goes, upon their breakup, Doris gifted Rubirosa a multi-million-dollar thoroughbred stud farm in the Dominican Republic. To others, it might have looked like a staggering token of affection from a heartbroken heiress. But those who knew Doris Duke understood it was far more likely the opposite. It was the calculated price of her freedom, a magnificently extravagant severance package paid to be rid of a man whose continued presence in her life had become a liability. It was the ultimate power move from a woman who refused to be anyone's victim. The affair with Rubirosa was a thrilling, reckless chapter, a detour into a world of pure glamour and sensation. But its fleeting nature and bitter end only reinforced her deepest convictions about trust and independence, lessons that would profoundly shape her approach to love and life from that moment forward. Fresh from the tumultuous affair with Rubirosa, Doris Duke found herself caught in a powerful emotional riptide, a mix of heady infatuation and deep-seated vulnerability. It was in this volatile state that he reappeared, his charm turned up to a blinding intensity. In the early summer of 1947, while both were in Paris, Ruby launched a full-scale romantic assault, a masterclass in persuasion designed to overwhelm her lingering doubts. He was relentless, showering her with an intoxicating blend of attention, flattery, and grand old-world gestures that seemed to promise a life of endless passion and excitement. For a woman whose life had been a series of calculated transactions disguised as relationships, his whirlwind courtship felt like a genuine awakening, a chance to finally seize a reckless, romantic happiness for herself. The proposal was as impulsive as it was cinematic. Swept up in the fantasy he so expertly crafted, Doris said yes. The wedding was arranged with breakneck speed, a private ceremony held on September 1st, 1947, at a simple city hall in Paris. There were no sprawling guest lists, no society reporters elbowing for a glimpse. In a move that shocked everyone who knew her, Doris actively worked to keep the event a secret, a stark departure from the lavish public spectacle of her first marriage. She wore an understated navy blue suit, a deliberate rejection of the bridal white that had symbolized her previous failed union. This, she seemed to be declaring, was different. This was for her, but the red flags began to wave almost before the ink on the marriage license was dry. The first and most glaring warning was the prenuptial agreement, or rather, the stunning lack of one. The woman who had so shrewdly protected her fortune from Jimmy Cromwell, the heiress known for her sharp financial acumen and deep wariness, inexplicably signed nothing. She entered the marriage with no legal safeguards, leaving her astronomical wealth entirely vulnerable. To those on the outside, it was an unthinkable lapse in judgment. But it revealed a heartbreaking truth. Doris Duke, the world's richest woman, was so desperate to believe in this fairy tale, so hungry for a love that felt real and uncalculated, that she willingly abandoned her own hard-earned defenses. The 37 days that followed were not a honeymoon, but a rapid, brutal education in reality. The facade of the charming suitor began to crumble almost immediately. revealing the calculated operator beneath. Rubirosa's true priorities became painfully clear. He was less interested in a life with Doris than in a life funded by Doris. He presented her with exorbitant lists of demands: a customized racing car, a stable of polo ponies, a lavish allowance, and control over several of her financial accounts. He spoke openly and boastfully of the luxurious lifestyle they would lead, a vision that centered entirely on his own comfort and status. The romantic attentiveness of the courtship vanished, replaced by an entitled expectation that her fortune was now his to command. The most crushing blow, however, was the constant, humiliating evidence of his infidelity. Despite being on his best behavior for less than a month, Rubirosa could not curb his wandering eye. Doris began to receive anonymous phone calls and tips from so-called friends, informing her of his trysts with other women, some even occurring while she was in the same city. The rumors that had once seemed like spicy gossip now felt like a personal and public humiliation. The final, devastating realization dawned on her. She was not the great love of his life. She was not even a unique conquest. She was simply the next in a long, prestigious line of wealthy widows and heiresses, the latest trophy in his collection, and potentially his most lucrative catch yet. The collapse was as swift as it was inevitable. The marriage, built on a foundation of fantasy and manipulation, could not survive the harsh light of truth. After just 37 days, Doris Duke did what she had once been incapable of doing. She walked away. She demanded a divorce, her pride and her heart battered, but her resolve intact. The divorce settlement, as one might expect, was spectacularly expensive. To secure her freedom from Ruby, she was forced to pay a king's ransom, a parting gift rumored to be well over $1 million, along with a valuable jewelry collection and other assets. It was a staggeringly high price, but for Doris, it was worth every penny. The money bought her escape from a gilded trap of her own making, closing a chapter of breathtaking naivete that would never be reopened. The experience didn't just break her heart. It shattered any remaining illusions she had about love, confirming her most cynical view that in the end, she would always be seen first as a fortune, and only ever after as a woman. The dizzying spectacle of the Rubirosa affair and its humiliating collapse marked a profound turning point for Doris Duke. It was the final, definitive lesson that the glittering world of high society held nothing for her but heartbreak and exploitation. Exhausted by the relentless public scrutiny and profoundly disillusioned by the parade of suitors who saw her as a trophy or a bankroll, she made a conscious, decisive choice. She would withdraw. The world's richest woman, who had been a headline since the day she was born, would simply vanish from view. This was not a passive retreat, but an active, deliberate campaign to reclaim her life, constructing a new existence defined by privacy, passion, and control. She turned her back on the New York and European social circuits that had brought her so much grief and retreated into the sanctuaries she had built for herself. Her life became a circuit between her magnificent estates, each one a self-contained world offering a different facet of the solitude she craved. Rough Point in Newport, with its wild Atlantic views and sprawling lawns, became her East Coast fortress. Shangri-La in Hawaii was her tropical paradise, a vibrant monument to her artistic passions. She also maintained homes in Somerville, New Jersey, and later, a more modest but still elegant residence in the Beverly Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles, chosen for its climate and distance from the prying eyes of the East Coast media. In these private domains, she cultivated an existence of meticulously controlled isolation. She was the queen of her own small kingdoms, and her court consisted of a carefully vetted, intensely loyal staff. These were not mere employees. They were her confidantes, her protectors, and often her only companions. Her longtime butler, Bernard Lafferty, became a particularly powerful gatekeeper, managing access to her with fierce dedication. She demanded and received absolute discretion, and in return, she provided her inner circle with a life of comfort and security, binding them to her with a mix of generosity and an implicit understanding that their loyalty was to her, not to the outside world. Freed from the performative demands of society life, she was finally able to fully immerse herself in the pursuits that genuinely fulfilled her. This was the era of her most passionate and prolific work. At Shangri-La, she became a full-time curator and architect, constantly refining her vision, commissioning new tiles from Moroccan artisans, and integrating the countless treasures she continued to acquire. She didn't just collect art, she lived within it, using her priceless Islamic ceramics at dinner parties for her small circle of guests and lounging on centuries-old textiles. Her other great love was gardening, and she approached it with the same intensity and perfectionism she applied to everything else. At each of her homes, she designed and cultivated spectacular gardens, getting her hands dirty alongside her gardeners. She developed a particular expertise in orchids, cultivating rare and fragile species in elaborate greenhouses. These gardens were not for show. They were her private sanctuaries, places for quiet contemplation and creative expression, where she could exercise total control over a living, beautiful world, something her chaotic public life had never allowed. This strategic withdrawal was her ultimate act of self-preservation. By removing herself from the spotlight, she silenced the gossip columns and reclaimed her narrative. The enigmatic, reclusive heiress became a far more powerful figure than the scandal-plagued socialite ever could be. Her absence fueled a mystique that only grew over the decades, transforming her from a tabloid fixture into a legend. In choosing solitude, Doris Duke didn't disappear. She finally found the freedom to become her most authentic self, surrounded by the beauty she created and protected by the walls she had so deliberately built. While the dramatic cliffs of Newport and the tropical serenity of Hawaii offered refuge, Doris Duke sought a third act far from the world that had defined her first two. In the sun-drenched canyons of Los Angeles, she discovered a new kind of sanctuary, one steeped in its own unique mythology. In 1953, she acquired one of Hollywood's most legendary properties, Falcon's Lair. Perched high in the Benedict Canyon area of the Hollywood Hills, the sprawling estate was originally built in the 1920s as a passionate love nest for the silent film icon Rudolph Valentino. His sudden death in 1926, just after its completion, cast an eternal shadow of tragic romance over the property, a narrative of glamour and loss that undoubtedly resonated with its new, equally enigmatic owner. Doris was not drawn to the estate for its cinematic history, but for its potential as the ultimate private retreat. She paid a reported $50,000 for the property, a fraction of its original cost, and immediately embarked on a mission to transform it. Valentino's original Moorish-style villa, with its arched windows and tiled courtyards, provided a perfect architectural foundation for her own aesthetic. She infused the home with her signature style, seamlessly blending the existing Hollywood grandeur with the exquisite Islamic and Southeast Asian art she continued to collect. Rooms were adorned with Persian carpets, Indian sculptures, and intricate textiles, turning the former movie star's home into a sophisticated gallery that felt both globally inspired and intensely personal. Her life at Falcon's Lair was a masterclass in controlled seclusion. The estate, hidden behind high gates and surrounded by lush, secluded gardens, was her fortress against the prying eyes of the world. Unlike the ostentatious displays of her youth, her presence in Los Angeles was whisper quiet. She was the city's most famous invisible resident. She avoided the flashy celebrity parties of the era, preferring to host small, intimate gatherings for a carefully curated circle of guests. Her social life was not about being seen. It was about genuine connection with people she found interesting, far from the social climbers and fortune hunters of her past. This select group reflected her evolving interests and intellectual curiosity. At Falcon's Lair, her dinner guests were less likely to be oil magnates or European aristocrats, and more often pioneering figures from the worlds of art, music, and design. She developed friendships with groundbreaking interior designer Tony Duquette, who shared her passion for global artifacts and theatrical flair. She mingled with actors and directors who valued art and conversation over publicity. She was even known to quietly support various cultural and humanitarian causes in the city, though always with the strict condition of anonymity. Her philanthropy in Los Angeles was conducted without fanfare, a silent force for good that few ever knew about. During this period, her relationship with the entertainment world took a fascinatingly hands-on turn. Her lifelong love of music, particularly jazz, found a new outlet. She became a quiet patron of several avant-garde musicians and composers, offering financial backing for recording projects and performances. There were even whispers of a more direct involvement. Some sources suggest she may have anonymously funded a few documentary films, drawn to the artistic process and the power of storytelling. This was not the work of a bored heiress dabbling in a new hobby, but of a serious patron engaging with the creative pulse of a new city on her own discrete terms. Falcon's Lair became the perfect expression of her middle years, a home that was both a glamorous Hollywood landmark and an utterly private world, a place where she could simultaneously be at the center of a creative community and entirely removed from its public glare. It was here that Doris Duke perfected her role as the reclusive connoisseur, a woman who had traded the exhausting performance of society life for the rich, authentic pleasure of a life curated by her own impeccable taste and guarded by her own unwavering rules. Yet even in her carefully constructed world of art and seclusion, the deep-seated human need for connection and legacy remained. For all the control Doris Duke exerted over her environment, one thing eluded her, a true heir, not to her fortune, but to her spirit. She had no children of her own, and the bitter lessons of her romantic life had long since closed off that path. This profound loneliness This yearning for a meaningful relationship, untainted by financial calculation, set the stage for one of the most surprising and controversial chapters of her entire life. In the late 1980s, at the age of 76, Doris would make a decision that would shock her inner circle and captivate the public all over again. She would legally adopt a daughter. This was not the adoption of a child, but of a 32-year-old woman named Shandy Hefner. Their meeting seemed to unfold like a story written by fate, or perhaps by shrewd opportunism. Shandy was a striking figure, a dedicated follower of the Hare Krishna movement, who had moved to Hawaii in search of spiritual community. She was also an accomplished equestrian with a deep love for animals, a passion she shared with Doris. They were introduced through a mutual acquaintance in the Hawaiian horse world, and an immediate, intense bond formed between the two women. To the isolated octogenarian, Shandy must have appeared as a kindred spirit, someone who understood the sanctity of quiet reflection, the beauty of nature, and the profound connection one can have with animals. Their relationship blossomed with a surprising speed and intensity. Doris, who had spent a lifetime keeping people at a professional distance, seemed to open up to Shandy in a way she had with very few others. They spent long hours together riding horses through the Hawaiian landscape, discussing Eastern philosophy and spirituality, and walking the serene grounds of Shangri-La. For Doris, it was a chance to finally share her world with someone who seemed to appreciate it for its beauty and tranquility, not for its monetary value. She lavished Shandy with attention and gifts, including a prized Arabian horse, and began introducing her to staff and friends as her spiritual daughter. This was more than a friendship. It was the emotional fulfillment of a lifelong void. The decision to make it legal, however, sent shockwaves through Doris's tightly controlled world. In 1988, she formally petitioned a Hawaiian court to adopt Shandy Hefner as her adult daughter. Her stated reason was to ensure Shandy would be considered a legal heir, a move that would irrevocably place her at the front of the line for an inheritance worth billions. For Doris's longtime advisors, lawyers, and loyal household staff, this was not a beautiful story of late-in-life connection. It was a 5-alarm fire. They watched with growing alarm as Shandy's influence seemed to swell. She was given a generous allowance, a home on the Shangri-La property, and unprecedented access to the deeply private heiress. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, suspicions that this was not a genuine spiritual meeting of minds, but a brilliantly executed long game by a charismatic figure who had identified a lonely, elderly billionaire and skillfully inserted herself into her life. The adoption created a deep and bitter rift. Doris's closest confidantes, including her butler Bernard Lafferty and her legal team, were fiercely protective of her and deeply skeptical of Shandy's motives. They saw the adoption as a dangerous vulnerability, a threat to the careful estate planning that was meant to preserve Doris's legacy for philanthropy. Tensions within the household became palpable, with staff divided between those who remained loyal to the existing power structure and those who sought to align themselves with the heiress's new favorite. The woman who had spent decades building walls to keep the world out had, in a moment of profound vulnerability, opened a gate, and no one watching from the inside was sure if a savior or a predator had just walked through. Yet amidst the personal turmoil surrounding her controversial adoption, Doris Duke was quietly orchestrating the most meaningful and impactful chapter of her life. The reclusive heiress, often portrayed as an eccentric loner, was in fact a visionary philanthropist whose later decades were a whirlwind of strategic, passionate giving. She moved beyond the simple donations of her youth, transforming her vast wealth into a powerful engine for change, funding causes that reflected her deepest personal convictions, a reverence for the natural world, and a profound compassion for human suffering. This was not charity for social clout. It was a deeply private, meticulously planned mission to leave a legacy far more significant than her famous name. Her love for the land, cultivated in the serene gardens of her various estates, blossomed into a major national conservation effort. She understood that true wealth was not just monetary but ecological, and she dedicated enormous resources to preserving America's vanishing landscapes. Through her newly established Doris Duke Foundation, she launched monumental initiatives aimed at protecting threatened ecosystems. One of her most significant contributions was a landmark $5 million grant to the Nature Conservancy's Last Great Places campaign, a nationwide effort to identify and save critical habitats from development. This wasn't a passive donation. It was a transformative investment that helped the organization pioneer the use of conservation easements, a legal tool that protects land in perpetuity. Her funding directly saved thousands of acres of forest, coastline, and prairie, ensuring they would remain wild for generations to come. This passion for preservation was deeply personal. She wasn't just saving abstract nature. She was protecting the very kind of quiet, beautiful spaces where she herself had found solace and peace throughout her life. This environmental zeal extended fiercely to the protection of wildlife, particularly her beloved animals. Her estates had always been sanctuaries for a menagerie of pets and rescued creatures, but her philanthropy scaled this personal compassion to a grand level. She was a major benefactor of organizations working to protect endangered species, with a special focus on the plight of elephants and primates. Horrified by the exotic animal trade and the conditions in many zoos, she funded sanctuaries and research programs dedicated to ethical treatment and conservation. She also supported groundbreaking work in wildlife medicine and the study of animal behavior, believing that understanding was the key to protection. Her generosity in this area was a direct reflection of the trust she placed in animals, a trust she often found lacking in people. Perhaps most surprising and most telling of her character was her pioneering and courageous support for medical research, particularly during the AIDS crisis. In the 1980s, as the epidemic ravaged communities and was met with widespread public fear and government inaction, Doris Duke stepped into the breach with extraordinary courage and compassion. At a time when many corporations and foundations were refusing to touch the issue, her foundation became one of the largest private funders of AIDS research in the world. She directed millions of dollars to top medical institutions like the University of North Carolina and Duke University, funding critical work on retroviruses, vaccine development, and patient care. This was not a safe or popular cause for a wealthy socialite, even a reclusive one. It was a bold, humanitarian stand that saved countless lives. Her support extended to child welfare, with massive gifts to children's hospitals and programs aimed at preventing child abuse, a cause that echoed her own early loneliness and perhaps a desire to shield other children from suffering. Her approach to this immense philanthropy was as meticulous as her approach to collecting art. She worked closely with a small team of advisors, studying proposals, questioning strategies, and demanding accountability. She wanted to see tangible, measurable results: lives saved, acres protected, diseases cured. This was the final and ultimate expression of her desire for control, not over people, but over outcomes. She was using her fortune to steer the world, in some small way, toward a future she believed in. A future with more beauty, less suffering, and more protected wild spaces where a person could simply breathe. While the world was fascinated by the scandal of her personal life, Doris Duke was single-handedly funding a quieter, more profound revolution, ensuring that her greatest legacy would be one of healing and preservation. Her immense fortune, while granting unparalleled freedom, also sculpted a world of breathtaking peculiarities, a life so far removed from the ordinary that it inevitably fostered the legend of Doris Duke, the eccentric recluse. These were not mere rumors invented by the press. They were the natural byproducts of a woman who could shape her entire reality to her exact, often unconventional specifications. At her Newport estate, Rough Point, the most famous residents after Doris herself were not socialites, but a pair of camels. She had encountered these magnificent, placid creatures during her travels, and, charmed by their gentle nature, decided to import them to graze on the oceanfront lawns. The image of these exotic animals roaming the clipped greensward against a backdrop of the Atlantic Ocean was a perfect metaphor for her life. The utterly unexpected seamlessly integrated into the height of tradition, a touch of the bizarre in the most refined of settings. This ability to fulfill any whim extended to her daily existence, which operated with the precision and insulation of a royal court. Her shyness, a trait forged in the relentless glare of her childhood, was profound. She loathed being photographed and would often go to great lengths to avoid unfamiliar faces, sometimes even instructing her drivers to take alternate routes to evade tourists gathered outside her gates. Yet this reticence existed in stark contrast to a famously mercurial and exacting temper, particularly with her staff. She demanded perfection and could be fiercely critical if her standards were not met. A vase placed slightly off-center, a meal served a minute late, a speck of dust on a precious artifact, these small failures could trigger a storm of displeasure. For those in her employ, it was a high-stakes environment. The rewards of loyalty were great, but the cost of error was immediate and severe. This combination of immense shyness and blistering anger painted a picture of a woman deeply uncomfortable with the outside world, who exerted absolute control over the only world she could, the one inside her gates. That control manifested most visibly in her obsession with security and privacy. Her homes were not merely residences, they were fortresses. Rough Point was outfitted with a state-of-the-art alarm system and extensive camera surveillance, a remarkably advanced setup for its time. At Falcon's Lair in Los Angeles, the perimeter was secured with high walls and electronically controlled gates. Her fear was not irrational. She had been the target of numerous kidnapping threats and extortion attempts since childhood, and she lived with the constant, gnawing awareness that her wealth made her a perpetual target. This ever-present anxiety fueled a near-paranoid need to seal herself off, creating a barrier between her fragile self and a world she perceived as full of Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter potential threats. The legendary temper often flared when she felt these boundaries were breached, making her staff both her protectors and the nearest recipients of her pent-up fear and frustration. Another outlet for her need for control and speed was her vast and varied collection of cars. Unlike many collectors who sought vintage models for show, Doris loved to drive, and she owned a fleet of vehicles tailored for every mood and purpose. She favored powerful, sleek sports cars like Heiress and Aston Martins for the thrill of the open road. But she also had a practical side, owning numerous station wagons she used for incognito trips into town or for hauling plants and gardening supplies between her estates. Each car was maintained in immaculate condition, a reflection of her own precise nature. Driving offered her a rare taste of anonymous freedom. Behind the wheel of a fast car, she was just another driver, momentarily liberated from the weight of her identity and the constant pressure of being Doris Duke. The day-to-day management of such extreme wealth was a colossal undertaking in itself, a full-time job for a small army of accountants, lawyers, and investment advisors. Her financial affairs were dizzyingly complex, a sprawling web of trusts, holding companies, and international investments that required constant tending. While she was a sharp and engaged businesswoman, particularly in later years, the sheer scale meant she relied heavily on her inner circle to execute her wishes. Every decision, from a multi-million-dollar stock trade to the purchase of a new piece of art, was documented, debated, and implemented by this dedicated team. This financial engine hummed in the background of her life, generating the immense resources that allowed for the camels, the cars, and the conservation, ensuring that the world of Doris Duke remained a perfectly ordered, utterly self-contained universe, funded by a fortune as vast and deep as the ocean that crashed against the cliffs below her Newport home. And yet, within this fortress of self-imposed isolation, one figure was granted unparalleled access, steadily ascending from a position of service to one of immense, and some would say sinister, influence. That man was Bernard Lafferty, an Irish-born butler whose journey into Doris Duke's innermost circle reads like a Gothic novel. He did not arrive as a power player. He began his tenure in her household in the late 1970s, initially as a member of the extensive staff at her New Jersey estate, Duke Farms. With his soft-spoken demeanor, impeccable service, and a seemingly intuitive understanding of her need for quiet efficiency, Bernard slowly began to distinguish himself. His rise was not meteoric, but a gradual, calculated process of building trust. He mastered the intricate, unspoken rhythms of her daily life, anticipating her needs before she voiced them. He learned her exacting standards for how a room should be set, how a meal should be served, and most importantly, how her profound desire for privacy should be enforced. He became the ultimate gatekeeper, the human extension of her security systems, and in doing so, he made himself indispensable. For a woman who trusted almost no one, Bernard's unwavering discretion and his ability to maintain the perfectly ordered silence she craved became the most valuable currency he could offer. As Doris entered her 70s and 80s, her health began to naturally decline, and with that physical vulnerability came an even greater dependence on the small circle around her. Bernard's role evolved dramatically from head of household operations to personal attendant, and finally, to her primary confidante and de facto manager. He was the one who brought her meals, managed her medications, and controlled all access to her, deciding who was allowed to visit and for how long. This power to isolate her became his most potent tool. He expertly positioned himself as her sole protector against a world full of people who, he subtly implied, only wanted her money. This narrative of protection was weaponized most effectively against Shandy Hefner. The controversial adult adoption had created a rival center of influence within Doris's world, and Bernard perceived Shandy as the single greatest threat to his own position. He worked diligently to drive a wedge between the two women, feeding Doris's inherent suspicions and highlighting Shandy's every perceived misstep. He reportedly monitored their interactions closely, casting Shandy's genuine affection in his telling as a carefully rehearsed performance. He positioned himself as the loyal servant defending his vulnerable mistress from a cunning opportunist, a story that played directly into Doris's deepest fears about human motivation. His campaign was ultimately successful. The relationship between Doris and her adopted daughter soured, leading to a bitter estrangement and a legally contested reversal of the adoption just a few years later, a move that many close observers believed was heavily influenced by Bernard and the legal team aligned with him. With Shandy removed from the picture, Bernard's influence swelled to encompass nearly every aspect of her life. He was not just managing her home, he was managing her world. He had her ear on financial matters, often sitting in on meetings with her lawyers and bankers. He controlled her communication, filtering her mail and screening her phone calls. For an elderly woman growing increasingly frail and detached from the outside world, Bernard Lafferty became the lens through which she saw everything and the hand that guided nearly every decision. He had effectively built a wall around her, with himself as the only gate, and in her final years, the line between devoted servant and controlling manipulator became dangerously blurred, setting the stage for a posthumous legal war that would question every intention and exploit the profound loneliness of a woman who had everything, yet in the end, could trust almost no one at all. The final chapter of Doris Duke's life unfolded not amidst the grandeur of her public persona, but in the hushed, heavily guarded seclusion of Falcon's Lair. By the fall of 1993, the vibrant, globe-trotting heiress was a ghost of her former self. At 80 years old, her body was frail, her health deteriorating under the cumulative weight of a long life and a series of undisclosed medical conditions that required constant care. She had become almost entirely bedridden, a recluse in the very home she had chosen for its privacy and peace. The world outside continued to spin, but within the walls of the Hollywood estate, time seemed to slow to a fragile, precious crawl. Her inner circle had shrunk to a bare minimum, dominated by two figures who now controlled every aspect of her existence: her butler, Bernard Lafferty, and her personal physician, Dr. Charles Kivovitz. Bernard's role had evolved far beyond that of a household manager. He was her primary caretaker, gatekeeper, and constant companion, the one who monitored her medications, managed her diet, and decided who could, and more importantly, who could not, see her. Dr. Kivovitz, meanwhile, was making near-daily house calls, attending to the complex medical needs of his famously private and immensely wealthy patient. This arrangement, while ostensibly for her comfort and protection, would later be scrutinized under a microscope of intense suspicion. On October 28, 1993, Doris Duke died in her bed at Falcon's Lair. The official cause of death was recorded as a heart attack, a conclusion that, on its surface, seemed unremarkable for a woman of her advanced age. Yet, from the very moment the news broke, the circumstances felt unsettlingly murky. The public announcement was delayed, and the details provided were frustratingly vague, a stark contrast to the blazing headlines that had announced her every move for 8 decades. This lack of immediate transparency acted like kindling on the smoldering embers of public curiosity. The rumors ignited almost instantaneously, fueled by the bizarre and seemingly conflicting actions of those closest to her. Whispers began to circulate about the exact nature of her final hours. Why had a woman of such unimaginable wealth died in her home and not in a world-class hospital surrounded by a team of specialists? What was the precise cocktail of medications being administered to her in those final days, and who was overseeing their dosage? Most pointedly, people asked why Bernard Lafferty, her butler, seemed to be in a position of such overwhelming authority immediately following her passing. His behavior was described by some as strangely theatrical, even celebratory, a jarring contrast to the solemnity of the moment. The figure of Dr. Kivovitz also came under a shadow of doubt. Questions arose about the ethical boundaries of a doctor making house calls for such a vulnerable patient under the watchful eye of a powerful domestic employee. Had medical judgment been entirely independent, or had it been subtly influenced by the person who controlled access to the patient? The swift cremation of Doris Duke's body, in accordance with instructions whose origin was immediately contested, had the irreversible effect of eliminating any possibility for an independent autopsy, a fact that conspiracy theorists would seize upon as the ultimate red flag. This potent combination of factors, the immense fortune at stake, the reclusive nature of her final days, the dominant presence of a servant in a medical scenario, and the swift, final disposal of the body, created a perfect storm for speculation. It seemed inconceivable to the public that the end of the Duke dynasty, the final extinguishing of a gilded age flame, could be so simple, so quiet, so medically straightforward. The official story of a heart attack felt inadequate, almost insulting, to the legend of a woman whose entire life had been a tapestry of drama, scandal, and breathtaking defiance. In the vacuum of hard facts, a far more compelling and sinister narrative began to take root, one that suggested the richest woman in the world had not simply died, but had been helped along into the hereafter by those she trusted most. The quiet, controlled world Doris Duke had so meticulously built shattered into a billion pieces the moment her will was read. In death, as in life, she commanded front-page headlines, but this time the story was not one of glamour or eccentricity. It was a blueprint for legal warfare. The document she left behind was a thunderclap, a final, posthumous act of defiance that would ignite one of the most sensational and protracted probate battles in American history. The central breathtaking revelation was that the vast majority of her $1.2 billion fortune, a sum so large it was difficult to comprehend, was not going to family or friends, but to a single entity she had established, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. This was not entirely unexpected, given her lifelong philanthropy, but the sheer scale of the bequest was staggering. She had effectively anointed her foundation as the primary heir to the Duke dynasty, cementing her legacy not through bloodlines, but through a perpetual engine for the causes she cherished: medical research, child welfare, and the preservation of the environment and arts. Yet it was the second, far more controversial provision that sent shockwaves through the room and would soon dominate the news cycles. Doris Duke had named Bernard Lafferty, her butler, as one of the co-executors of her colossal estate. Even more astonishingly, the will granted him a position of immense power, including a lifetime appointment as a special advisor to the foundation with a generous annual salary of $500,000, a luxurious apartment in one of her buildings, and a significant role in overseeing the distribution of her charitable billion. To the outside world, and to the relatives and former associates now gathered in disbelief, this was an unconscionable elevation. It appeared that a domestic servant, a man whose official role was to manage the household staff, had been handed the keys to the kingdom, positioned to influence the flow of one of the greatest private fortunes on earth. The third seismic provision was the one that guaranteed a fight. Shandy Hefner, the adopted daughter for whom Doris had once held such spiritual hope, was pointedly and explicitly written out of the will. After the very public adoption and the equally public, bitter estrangement that Bernard Lafferty was accused of orchestrating, Shandy received nothing. Not a single dollar, not a piece of jewelry, not even a token of their once close relationship. This calculated disinheritance was the spark that lit the fuse. For Shandy, it was a profound personal betrayal and a legal declaration of war. For the wider circle of Duke relatives, including cousins who had expected at least some recognition, it was the final proof that a cabal led by Lafferty and a few key advisors had isolated and manipulated a vulnerable old woman in her final days, bending her ear and her will to their own advantage. The stage was now set for an epic legal free-for-all, a multi-front war fought with teams of the most expensive lawyers money could buy. Shandy Hefner immediately filed a formal challenge to the will, alleging that Doris had been unduly influenced by Bernard Lafferty in her final, frail years. She painted a picture of a manipulative servant who had systematically isolated the heiress, poisoned her mind against her adopted daughter, and insinuated himself into her legal and financial affairs for his own gain. Simultaneously, a group of Duke's distant relatives also joined the fray, contesting the will on similar grounds. They argued that Lafferty and Dr. Charles Kivovitz, her personal physician, had over-medicated her, clouding her judgment and making her susceptible to their influence. They pointed to the swift cremation as a deliberate act to destroy evidence, and they demanded a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death. The probate court in Manhattan was suddenly the arena for a dizzyingly complex drama, a spectacle that laid bare the immense pressures and potential for corruption that swirl around such vast wealth. On one side stood Bernard Lafferty and the lawyers who had drafted the will, insisting they had simply followed the clear, long-held wishes of a fiercely independent woman who trusted her butler more than her own family. On the other side stood a coalition of the disinherited, united in their belief that a great injustice had been perpetrated, that the Doris Duke they knew would never have willingly created such a lopsided, and in their view, absurd arrangement. The case was no longer about a simple inheritance. It was a gripping mystery, a high-stakes investigation into the very nature of influence, loyalty, and the fragile line between devoted care and criminal manipulation at the end of a life. The reading of the will was not an end, but a declaration of war, and Shandy Hefner was the first to charge into battle. Represented by a formidable legal team, she launched a formal challenge that ripped the lid off Doris Duke's final years, transforming a probate hearing into a courtroom drama of Gothic proportions. Her central allegation was a bombshell. She claimed that Bernard Lafferty and Dr. Charles Kivovitz had engaged in a deliberate and calculated campaign of undue influence over a mentally and physically vulnerable elderly woman. The petition painted a chilling picture of a trusted butler and a complicit physician who had systematically isolated Doris, poisoning her mind against her adopted daughter while simultaneously positioning themselves to reap an unimaginable financial windfall from her demise. This was no simple dispute over assets. It was an accusation of profound betrayal at the most vulnerable moment of a person's life. These allegations gained terrifying traction when they merged with a parallel criminal investigation. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, tipped off by the suspicious circumstances, opened a formal probe into the very manner of Doris Duke's death. The focus zeroed in on Dr. Kivovitz's medical care, specifically the powerful cocktail of medications, including morphine and sedatives, prescribed to the ailing heiress in her final days. Investigators wanted to know if the dosages administered were medically appropriate for her condition, or if they had been intentionally increased to cloud her judgment, making her more pliable to Lafferty's suggestions, or worse, to hasten her death. The swift cremation of her body, carried out on Bernard Lafferty's authority, was now seen not as the execution of a wish, but as the potential destruction of evidence, a move that made it impossible to ever determine with certainty the precise role her medications played. The scandal was no longer confined to civil court. It now carried the ominous weight of a potential homicide investigation. Under this intense legal and public scrutiny, the house of cards began to collapse. The co-executors named in the will, including the powerful bank that was supposed to serve alongside Bernard Lafferty, realized the estate was careening toward a catastrophic and endless legal quagmire that would bleed billions in fees and destroy its value. Faced with the DA's investigation and the relentless press frenzy, a series of stunning settlements were negotiated behind closed doors. In a dramatic reversal, Bernard Lafferty agreed to relinquish virtually all of his power. He resigned as co-executor, forfeited his lifetime salary and advisory role at the foundation, and accepted a significantly reduced, though still immense, lump sum payout, rumored to be several $1 million in exchange for walking away quietly. It was a strategic retreat, a deal that gave him a fortune but stripped him of the control he had fought so hard to secure. Shandy Hefner also reached a settlement, though the terms remained fiercely confidential. While she did not regain the status of primary heir, she received a substantial financial package, a resolution that many interpreted as an acknowledgement that her claims of manipulation held serious merit, even if they were never formally proven in a court of law. The distant Duke relatives who had joined the challenge also received modest payouts, effectively buying their silence and closing down their legal fronts. The real victor emerging from the smoke of this battle was the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. With Lafferty removed and the challenges settled, it finally gained clear and uncontested control over the entire fortune, ensuring that the billions would flow to the medical, environmental, and cultural causes Doris had championed, rather than into the pockets of those who stood accused of manipulating her final days. The woman who spent a lifetime building walls to protect herself had, in the end, required a battalion of lawyers and prosecutors to finally secure her legacy from within her own inner circle. And so, from the ashes of bitter litigation and sensational headlines, the true, enduring monument to Doris Duke's life finally emerged, untethered from the chaos of her final years. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, once just a name in a contested legal document, began its real work, activating the staggering $1.2 billion endowment to become a perpetual force for the causes its namesake held most dear. This was not the passive distribution of wealth common among many estates. It was the precise, strategic execution of a vision Doris had spent a lifetime refining. The Foundation's mission statement reads like a map of her soul: to improve the quality of people's lives through grants supporting the performing arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and the prevention of child maltreatment. In each of these pillars, we see the reflection of the woman herself, her love for beauty, her reverence for nature, her pragmatic compassion, and her deep, empathetic understanding of a lonely childhood. The scale of its impact is almost incomprehensible. In the arts, the Foundation didn't just fund established institutions. It became a vital lifeline for individual artists, particularly in jazz, theater, and contemporary dance, fields often struggling for sustainable support. Through flagship programs like the Doris Duke Artist Awards, it provides multi-year, unrestricted grants directly to performers, a model of patronage that trusts the creative vision of the artist above all else. This approach, granting freedom rather than imposing restrictions, was pure Doris Duke, a belief that true artistry flourishes not under micromanagement, but with the resources and liberty to explore. In environmental conservation, the Foundation took up her mantle as a steward of the natural world, funding ambitious initiatives to protect critical wildlife habitats, address climate change, and promote sustainable practices across the country. It continues her hands-on legacy, not just writing checks, but actively partnering with scientists, activists, and policymakers to enact tangible, lasting change for the planet she loved. Perhaps most profoundly, the Foundation's work in medical research and child welfare directly channels her personal experiences and her clear-eyed view of human suffering. Its support for clinical research, particularly in fields like infectious diseases and brain health, accelerates discoveries that save lives daily, a silent, powerful tribute to the woman who once quietly funded AIDS research when few others would. Its commitment to preventing child abuse and neglect builds systems of support and intervention, striving to protect the vulnerable and give every child the sense of security she often found lacking in her own gilded youth. This is the ultimate paradox of her legacy. A woman who struggled to find connection in her own life has, through this foundation, fostered millions of connections between a researcher and a cure, an artist and an audience, a child and a safe future. The scandalous headlines have faded into history books, and the whispered rumors about her final days are now footnotes for true crime enthusiasts. What remains, growing stronger with each passing year, is the transformative power of her philanthropy. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation ensures that her name is no longer synonymous primarily with camels and couture, but with cancer breakthroughs and conserved coastlines, with daring new dance productions and resilient communities. She designed it to be her ultimate act of control, a way to shape the world according to her values long after she was gone. In that, she succeeded beyond measure. The lonely heiress who built walls around her homes has, through this enduring institution, built bridges to a better world, ensuring that her vast fortune finally and forever serves its highest purpose, not to isolate one life, but to enrich millions. So what are we to make of this astonishingly complex woman, the last great heiress of a bygone age? The life of Doris Duke stands as one of history's most captivating paradoxes, a living contradiction who embodied the double-edged sword of unimaginable privilege. She was a woman who could purchase entire continents of luxury, but could not buy the simple, uncalculated love she craved. A shy, intensely private soul whose most personal heartbreaks and triumphs were served up as public spectacle for the entire world to consume. A controversial figure entangled in sensational scandals, who ultimately channeled her vast inheritance into a legacy of quiet, profound philanthropy that continues to heal and inspire long after her death. Her story forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. What does it truly mean to live a good life when the struggle for survival is removed? When every material desire is not just met, but anticipated? For Doris, the answer was not found in the ballrooms of Newport or the gossip columns of Paris, but in the silent act of creation and preservation. Her fulfillment was unearthed in the moist soil of her gardens, in the precise geometry of a centuries-old tile, in the meticulous planning of a grant that might save a species or cure a disease. She discovered that the only antidote to the isolation of great wealth was the act of giving it away, not for fame, but for the silent satisfaction of making the world, in some small way, more beautiful, more just, and more compassionate. Her greatest tragedy was also her greatest strength, a profound wariness that isolated her from genuine human connection, yet also protected her from the predators drawn to her fortune. This left her, in the end, surrounded by employees and advisors, but profoundly alone. And so we are left with her final, magnificent contradiction, a woman who built towering walls around her own heart, yet whose lasting monument is a foundation that tirelessly works to tear down walls of suffering, ignorance, and environmental decay. The gilded cage she was born into was one she could never fully escape, but she devoted her life and her fortune to ensuring that others could experience a little more freedom, a little more beauty, and a little less pain. So we turn this question over to you, the most compelling one her story leaves behind. When money is truly no object, what do you believe defines a life well lived? Is it the personal happiness she found so elusive? Or is it the lasting impact
on the world that she ultimately achieved?